Alice Stokes Paul dedicated her life to the notion of what she called ordinary equality. She came to the cause of women's suffrage when she saw Christabel Pankhurst heckled and forced off stage during a speech for women's right to vote. The Pankhursts' motto, "Deeds, not words," meant everything from speaking on street corners to participating in suffrage parades to throwing rocks and ultimately even to being arrested. The deeds were extreme, but ensured that the suffrage message was heard. Alice was sent to English prisons 3 times for her participation in the movement. While in prison, she went on hunger strike and had to endure painful forced feedings.
They usually tied me down by a sheet around the abdomen, by another around the lungs. One of the doctors stood behind and pulled my head back till it was parallel with the ground. He held it in this position by means of a towel drawn tightly around the throat. The other doctor put the tube down through the nostril. Then they poured the milk and liquid food into a funnel at the top of the tube. While the tube is going through the nasal passage, it is exceedingly painful.
Alice sailed home in January 1910. She introduced to the Pennsylvania suffrage movement bold new demonstration tactics, all from the Pankhurst playbook. Alice proved herself an innovative organizer and tactician in 1913 when she became chair of the Congressional Committee, a branch of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA. She traveled to Washington, D.C. to work for an amendment to the Constitution to give women the vote. Her counterpart in this work was Lucy Burns, a feisty young American lawyer whom she met in an English police station. In less than 3 months, the two organized a procession of over 8,000 men and women to march in Washington, D.C. in support of the women's vote. The procession attracted a huge crowd. As the marchers turned onto Pennsylvania Avenue, onlookers crowded the streets, preventing the parade from advancing. Hecklers tore at the marchers' banners and shouted at them to go home. Police did little to control the mounting chaos. The next morning, the parade and the riot, and more importantly, women's suffrage, were front-page news across the country. After several differences of opinion on tactics and strategy, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns left NAWSA and launched the National Woman's Party, or NWP. In 1916, President Wilson urged suffragists to stop their work in order to support America's war efforts in Europe. While many other women's organizations complied, Alice Paul refused, on the grounds that it was now more important than ever to have democracy at home before committing American lives to fight for democracy abroad. In January of 1917, the NWP launched a very bold new campaign to picket the White House. The Silent Sentinels, or Iron-Jawed Angels as one disgruntled senator called them, stood at the gates of the White House until November 1917, 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. In June, a group of young soldiers attacked the women for what they believed was unpatriotic behavior. Nearby police rushed in and arrested the women on the charge of obstructing traffic. Every day over the next several weeks, groups of picketers were arrested and sent to workhouses, jails, and mental asylums, all on the charge of obstructing traffic. Altogether, 168 suffragists went to jail between June and November of 1917. Imprisoned, the suffragists were fed rotten food, slept on hard stone floors, and endured filthy conditions. Alice joined the imprisoned suffragists in October, and soon after, she and the other women began a hunger strike. If any of the women died, it would lead to a political nightmare for the Wilson administration. Prison authorities initiated painful forced feedings 3 times a day. On the evening of November 14, 1917, a date suffragists called the Night of Terror, prison guards subjected incoming prisoners to violent beatings. News of the forced feedings and violence inflicted on the suffragists leaked out to newspapers and pressured the president to unconditionally release them. In January of 1918, President Wilson publicly announced his support of women's suffrage, and the House of Representatives immediately endorsed the women's suffrage amendment. It took several more months of open-air meetings, demonstrations, and forceful lobbying by the NWP to convince the Senate to pass the amendment. The 19th Amendment became law on August 26, 1920.
I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality.